Hello and welcome to Planet Outlook. This week, my guest is Ramesh Venkataraman. He is an ecosystem restoration specialist and trustee Junglescapes, an NGO which is in Karnataka and has been working on the ecosystem restoration front, especially around Bandipur. So, as you know, earlier this month, the World Environment Day theme was ecosystem restoration, and we have just kickstarted the decade of ecosystem and biodiversity restoration as per the United Nations Environment Program. So thank you, Ramesh, for joining us on Planet Outlook. Pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Ananda. Thank you for inviting me to the show.
So I guess since 2008, Junglescapes and you have been involved in the restoration process. But before I come to the ecosystem restoration part, for the viewers, if you can just tell us a little background on the invasive species and the problems that we have with invasives in the country.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Ananda. Um, Invasive species are a problem across India now. We have different invasives in different part of the country. If you look at the Nilgri Biosphere, that's where we work, we have a major invasive species called Lantana camara, which, as we know, came into India about 200 odd years ago. It was brought into India by the Britishers as an ornamental plant. And I believe it first came into Calcutta and then gradually spread across the country. And many of the protected areas in the Nilgiri Biosphere have very high presence of Lantana camara. We also have other invasive species like Prosopis juliflora, and we have a new invasive species called Senna spectabilis, which is occupying large areas of places like Wayanad, Coorg, also some parts of Mudumalai Tiger Reserve, etc. Now, what happens when these invasive species come in is that they dominate the landscape and gradually push out the native species of vegetation. As we know, native species of vegetation or indigenous species are an integral part of our ecosystems, and they form a network of life in these ecosystems where many animals depend on these plants for their survival. So when these get pushed away and replaced by invasive species, we start seeing a reduction in availability of food for the animals. And also in species like butterflies, we could see actually a decline in the number of species present in that area, because as you know, butterflies require native species as host plants for laying their eggs. So when these host plants disappear, you gradually see a decline in the number of butterflies. So this is an example of how invasive species can also lead to a reduction in number of species, as well as reduction in availability of food for the megafauna. So megafauna like elephants, sambar deer, gaur, etc., get lesser opportunity to feed. And this is one of the reasons, I believe, that more and more animals are straying outside the forests into village areas and even into cities or towns like Ooty, which are seeing influx of animals from the forests. So the multiple impacts that invasive species play on the ecosystems, and this is a fairly serious problem across India, and that is why we say that the protected areas, although they are legally protected, they are ecologically exposed.
So if I look at a patch of green, it may look green, but it may not be, as in quote, the green, the value of green that I want from
Absolutely,
nature.
absolutely. It may look all that is green is not good.
So I believe the place that you work, Bandipur and the surrounding, is also a biodiversity hotspot. It's in the Western Ghats, and so if you can just for the viewers who've never been to Bandipur and Madumalai, and if you just can give us a background on that area.
Yeah, the Nilgiri Biosphere consists of Bandipur Tiger Reserve, the Mudumalai Tiger Reserve, Wayanad. Then we have the Nagarole Tiger Reserve. So it is a continuum of multiple protected areas, and it's one of the largest habitats for Asiatic elephants in the wild, as well as the Royal Bengal tigers in the wild. So it's a very, very important area in terms of biodiversity. And this whole Nilgiri Biosphere falls within the larger landscape of the Western Ghats, which, as we know, is the global biodiversity hotspot, also UN World Heritage Site. Now, Bandipur lies on the leeward side of the Western Ghats. It's in a slightly rain shadow region. It's at the edge of the Western Ghats. In fact, if you look at the easternmost parts of Bandipur, they are starting to get into the Eastern Ghats. So you can say it lies in the cusp of the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats. So it is a very ecologically very important kind of a region, because elephants migrate from the Western Ghats into the Eastern Ghats using these routes.
So now if I want to take you back to 2008 when you started, so what did you see? What was the problem and how did you approach this?
When we started in 2008, we started in the buffer areas of Bandipur Tiger Reserve, not in the core areas. And the buffer areas had a lot of degradation arising from human pressures, like livestock grazing and firewood collection, also some kind of collecting forest wood for other purposes. So people were using forest wood for other purposes as well. So we started restoring those areas which were not dominated by Lantana. They had Lantana camara, but in patches, but there are other kinds of degradation as well. So we started there. But as we moved along, we realized that unless we are able to find a solution to the problem of invasives, our restoration is not going to be very effective. That's why we gradually moved into the management of invasive species as well. So that is the progression that our activity took.
But how did you begin? It was with the local community. You had experts.
Yeah.
If somebody today, I'm just asking because if somebody who's listening to us and wants to start something in his or her local patch.
That's a very good question. In fact, when we started Ananda, we did not have ecological restoration in mind, because there were no precedents to ecological restoration in these areas. And it was a completely new concept for most people. So we were thinking of what kind of conservation activity can we do along with the local communities. So we happened to meet a particular village forest committee in a village called Lokere. There was a very good president of this particular village forest committee. And when we met him, he immediately called a meeting of all the committee members. And we sat and said, what should we do together? And these people then said, why don't we try and improve the quality of the forest in the hills closer to the village? So that is what's called the Lokere Reserve Forest, which is a buffer area of Bandipur, but also an important migratory corridor for elephants from one end of the one end of the Bandipur Tiger Reserve to the other end of the Bandipur Tiger Reserve. So it was their idea that we should improve the health of these forests, which were badly degraded. So as usual, we also started with the idea of planting saplings. And we did some sapling planting in 2008 in the first year. But then we found that the habitat is badly degraded. And these saplings are not establishing at all. And even after a year or two, we found the saplings have not grown at all. Neither the height had improved, nor the girth had improved. So we realized that this is not the right way to go. And we changed our strategy after that into something more holistic.
But before you planted the sapling, you had the invasive species, like you mentioned, Lantana. So how do you go about removing Lantana and other invasive species?
Each invasive species has its own methodology for removal. So because their structure is different and the way they get propagated is also different. So if you take Lantana camara, we follow the cut rootstock method, where we cut the rootstock of the Lantana shrub 2 to 3 inches below the soil. So this is a method developed by the Center for Ecological Management of Degraded Ecosystems, CEMDE, which is part of the University of Delhi. And they've used it extensively in Corbett and Rajaji tiger reserves. Over 10,000 hectares have been restored using this methodology. They also used it in other places like Sasangir. The advantage of this method, Ananda, is that the scar that you leave on the ground is hardly about 6 inches in diameter. because you're just slicing the rootstock 3 inches below the ground. The good thing about Lantana camara is that it is not a root sucker, which means the lateral roots do not produce fresh plants. So you can just chop off the side roots or the lateral roots, and it does not harm the surrounding native vegetation. If you were to use a JCB, for example, the surrounding native vegetation would also be destroyed. So you don't have any native plant material which then comes back. Also, the other problem is Lantana camara produces lakhs of seeds every year. And these seeds have a viability of 10 to 12 years. So you can imagine the site will have millions of Lantana seeds as a soil seed bank. So if you want to use any heavy machinery like a JCB to remove the Lantana, what happens is it is like tilling the soil, or preparing the agricultural land. So all the Lantana seeds under the soil get exposed to sunlight, and you end up with 10 to 20 times more Lantana than when you started. In fact, this was one of the reasons why, very unintentionally, JCBs were used in many places, and they all ended up with much thicker Lantana than before. So that is why the cut root stock method is very selective, and you just remove that particular plant with a small 6-inch diameter in the soil. There's no soil disturbance beyond that, and it takes hardly about 20 to 30 seconds to remove one plant. So we trained the local community members, mostly indigenous community members, in removing the Lantana. And now they've got experience of almost 8-9 years, so they're quite fast at removing Lantana.
So what about the soil, Ramesh? Once you remove an invasive species, I believe it also kind of damages the topsoil.
Yeah. Most invasive species have what is called an allelopathic effect. So they are infusing toxic chemicals into the soil. That is their way of preventing other vegetation from coming in. So it's kind of a barrier they create, a chemical barrier, by altering the soil conditions. So what our first line of defense is to get the grasses back, because grasses help in alleviating or repairing the soil. So when we remove Lantana, we try to bring the grasses back. You can do that either by using grass seeds. So we collect grass seeds during January or February during the seeding season, or we can also use grass slips. So you take existing grass clumps, split it into smaller pieces, and plant it in the soil. So once the grass comes back, slowly the microbial activity also starts picking up. So that helps in alleviating the soil. We don't use any other kind of bioremediation.
Also, Bandipur, the area you worked a couple of years back, was ravaged by fire. And you also started working on the restoration of those fire damaged parts of Bandipur. If you can tell us a bit on.
It's a very, very interesting topic. Unfortunately, Bandipur had big forest fires in 2019, and it took quite a lot of effort to put out the fires. A lot of people took exemplary effort to put out the fire. I think close to 8,000 or 10,000 hectares of forests were burnt in the fire. Now, if you look at the post-fire scenario, one would think that if there is a fire, the Lantana would disappear. And when we started restoring these fire-affected plots, we discovered that all the Lantana plants, practically every Lantana plant, was regenerating. We use the technical term copicing, in common terminology, regenerating from the base. So while the top portion of the Lantana looks completely burnt and black, the plant is regenerating from the base. All of them actually. So if we do not remove the Lantana for a couple of years, as I said earlier, the subsoil seed bank is very large, and fire helps to break the dormancy of the subsoil seed banks. It's a fire-loving plant. Lantana is a fire-loving plant. So it burns very well, and after burning, it regenerates 2 or 3 times stronger. So not only do the dormant seeds break the dormancy and fresh seedlings come up from the soil, the existing Lantana plants also start regenerating from the bottom. So you can imagine the place gets occupied by far more Lantana. So we started removing these burnt out Lantana. And the other important thing we tried to do was to make sure the the ash content remains on the soil because the ash is very valuable. So we made things like trenches so that the ash does not get washed away in the monsoons. And we have seen excellent recovery of native shrubs, native grasses in these fire affected areas.
So I believe you also work very closely with the forest department, the Karnataka Forest Department.
That's right.
If you can give us a sense how large this Lantana problem is in a protected area or a national park or tiger reserve like Bandipur. And what role is also the Karnataka Forest Department is playing? I know there are roles of various stakeholders of local community NGOs, but I also want to know the role of the Forest Department here.
The Forest Department, we've been working very closely since the beginning with the Forest Department. And the Forest Department has taken up invasive species management at a serious note in the last 5 to 6 years. There are many workshops have been held for training the field officers in managing invasive species. And we are seeing increasing activity on managing invasive species. In terms of the scale of the problem, estimates in Bandipur, which have been done in the past, show that around 60% of the area is occupied by Lantana. So if you look at Bandipur, which is around 1,000 square kilometers, around 600 square kilometers is occupied by this particular weed. And not all 600 square kilometers is densely occupied. Some of it might be lightly occupied, some moderately occupied, and some densely occupied. So detailed maps have been prepared of the level of invasion. And a strategic roadmap is now, I think, being prepared so that we can address this problem over the next 10 to 15 years. It's going to take at least 20 years to reach some degree of success in this.
I want to now come to the issue of planting your saplings and native species. So whenever there is a talk on environment issues and all, tree planting comes up at the very top of the order. It's a very noble idea to plant a tree, plant a sapling to save the earth and all that. But planting or a sapling also has to kind of follow a method, a set of formulas and a set of practices. You can't just go on planting trees anywhere. So being an ecosystem expert, if you can tell us a bit on this, Ramesh.
Yeah, as I said earlier, Ananda, we started off with sapling planting, and then we found the success rates in sapling planting were not excellent in our area because we are looking at a very low rainfall, rain shadow region with around 800 millimeters of rainfall a year. So we are not like high rainfall of 2,000 or 3,000 millimeters area per year. And sapling planting is not the panacea for all the problems. It is a very top-down approach, whereas ecosystem restoration is a bottom-up approach, where you first set right the soil, set right the hydrology, and allow nature to revive or recover, and then you observe what is coming back. And a lot of native species come back on their own, especially the shrubs. If you look at a forest like Bandipur, the diversity of shrubs is as larger than the diversity of trees. So we have maybe around 200 species of shrubs in this forest. So shrub vegetation is extremely important because a large number of animals depend on shrub vegetation. Now you do not get shrubs easily in any nursery, and people don't grow these kind of forest species of shrubs. So these have to be encouraged to come on their own. And this is where repairing the soil, improving the moisture levels in the soil, etc., become very important, that native vegetation comes back on its own. And this is what we are calling assisted natural regeneration. The advantage of assisted natural regeneration is that it is like 1/5 the cost of intensive methods like tree planting. So if I have a lakh of rupees, I can do 5 times the area with assisted natural regeneration than with other methods. So when we are talking about a very large area, tree planting is going to be quite infeasible also because it's expensive. Secondly, we can observe for 4 to 5 years as to what comes back naturally, because there is a lot of seed migration happening from nearby areas. We find species coming back where the mother trees are not present even within the surrounding 10 kilometers. So obviously they are being brought by seed dispersal agents like elephants from long distances. So there is seed migration potential over long distances. Also, many areas have subsoil seed banks of native species which remain dormant for a long time. So they get revived. Therefore, we find that allowing the area to recover on its own for 4 to 5 years and then analyzing which are the important species that are missing, and then we can plan to bring those species alone. The other question you asked was that there has to be a very structured approach to this because all tree species don't grow in all areas. Each one has got its own microhabitat. So in the forest, you find small areas where there are patches of a particular species. You go to another area, there is a patch of Terminalia chabula. You go to another area, there is a patch of Diospyros montana. So they do not grow everywhere. So we cannot grow and plant multiple species everywhere. So we need to understand the microhabitat requirements of every species and then plant them in those areas.
I gather time is a very important factor. It's a long-term commitment.
Restoration is a very long-term commitment. It takes close to 10 years to restore a single plot, especially if it is invasive species problem. Because if it is lantana, we have to remove the lantana in the second year, third year, very often in the fourth year as well. So it is a 4-year removal operation and then the restoration. So for it to reach about 60 to 70% of an ideal situation, it takes about 8 to 10 years.
But during this time, you've got also multiple awards from international agencies. And what are the major challenges? It's not been a very smooth ride.
Definitely not. The biggest challenge is getting feet on the ground, human resource intensive activity. We do not use any machinery in our restoration work. Everything is done by human resources because we don't want collateral damage inside the forest. And therefore, we need large numbers of people to do this. So over a period of time, initially we were doing restoration only during the monsoon months. And then we discovered that people would come and then they found that there is not much livelihood in the other months and they would go elsewhere. They would go to Kerala, they go to Tamil Nadu, etc. to work and they would not come back. So we had to build a restoration calendar covering the entire year so that people get a livelihood throughout the year. Even then, increasing the number of people has been a challenge because there are multiple livelihood options available now. There is intensive agriculture farming going on. So people get work as casual labor in the agricultural farms. So we managed to build a core team of about 50 people, but we would love to have a team of 200 people. And that is quite a challenge. Funding again is a challenge, Ananda.
Today, I was coming to that, Ramesh. I was coming to the funding part that when in this era of fast-paced life with targets, kind of annual targets, how difficult it is to convince funders and other stakeholders that, of course, this amount has been invested, but this is the time span of 10 years or 15 years, because the 10, 15-year scale is quite unthinkable for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's quite a big challenge. We've been fortunate to have funders like GE and Ashirvadam Trust in Bangalore who are convinced that this is a long-term proposition, and they've been willing to stay with us for 10 or 12 years. But not many funders are willing to do that, especially, CSR. They want to demonstrate results in 1 or 2 years. Now, of course, the CSR rules have been changed, so they can take a slightly longer view, but it's not easy to get funding for a very long-term project. So we are exploring newer avenues. The situation is that if you look at international grants, if we were to apply for a research grant, it's very high probability of getting it. But if you apply for a restoration grant, it's not that easy. So we need to think about how to get more money into restoration.
But you had a good run for last 12 years. So what's the future for the next 12, if I may ask?
As I said, we would certainly like to scale it up 3 or 4 times. And we are trying to work with the eco-development committees. Every national park has many eco-development committees, which are committees of the villagers. So we're trying to work with the eco-development committees, energize them, and it cannot be done obviously by one NGO. It has to be done by several organizations. So if we have 20 eco-development committees carrying out restoration, we have a very big multiplier effect. And there is also a huge livelihood impact coming out of this. And ultimately, they then become the kind of guardians of the forest. The local people become the guardians of the forest. And there is also a lot of ecological knowledge that they bring. Imagine we are working in an area which is full of elephants and tigers. So we have somebody from a city going there, they would run away in 2 days because it's such a hazardous kind of environment. Whereas the indigenous community people know how to go around and manage manage the risks in these particular scenarios. They also know about the vegetation, the soil types, etc. There's a lot of local knowledge that is invaluable for this effort.
But before I end, I just want to ask for the people who are tuned in, is that if I want to ask you maybe 2 or 3 points that people should always keep in mind while going for a restoration project, what would that be?
The first
your advice, basically your advice to viewers who are listening, who wants to take up?
Yeah. The first suggestion is that always do a pilot before you do something big. So if you want to restore 100 hectares of land, you first do a pilot on a 1 acre or 1 hectare plot of land and capture the learnings. That is first lesson, and we follow that very strictly. Even today, when we start a new initiative, we do a pilot. The second is follow the process. Restoration is not something we can do in an ad hoc manner. It's a very structured discipline, and there are international standards for restoration. Please, they're very simple documents to read, not very complicated. Please read the documents and follow the process. And third is be patient. Nature will reward us very well, and you can see be delighted by the way nature responds. But for that, you need the patience. These are the 3 important suggestions I would give.
Thank you, Ramesh. Wonderful chatting with you on Planet Outlook. Thank you so much. You stay safe, and hopefully someday in the future I'll come down south and see the work that's going on in Bandipur.
Sure, Ananda. Thank you very much, and wish all the listeners to stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.